Hello and welcome to the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual. I'm your host, Gail Z Martin, and today we're talking about grief anniversaries because, of course, we're coming right up on that 1-year anniversary to the end, for now, of Supernatural. So before we dive into that, let's let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, starting with Travis.
Hi, I'm Travis. I am a social worker at the San Diego Vet Center. I specialize in working with veterans with PTSD from combat trauma.
Lynn.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Zubernis. I'm a licensed psychologist and a professor at Westchester University, and my area of specialty research is the psychology of being a fan. A lot of my research is on fans of Supernatural, of which I am a passionate one. And my most recent 2 books are written with the actors and the fans of Supernatural. Family Don't End with Blood, with a pretty cover, and the one celebrating the legacy of the show, There'll Be Peace When You Are Done.
Great. Susan?
Wonderful. Lynn, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to do the same with the books. I'm Susan Nylander. I teach English at Barstow College. And along with my colleague, Mandy Taylor, we wrote, I guess I have to put it right in, it's going to be tough. It's Death and Supernatural is our text. And I probably have to get rid of the beautiful background, and we don't want to do that. Death and Supernatural was written about the ways that the show represents and presents death. And of course, that includes grief. And I also wrote my master's thesis on the 19th century culture of death and melancholy with Walt Whitman's elegies. And so I am keenly interested in how death and grief is dealt with, especially in American culture. And that's something we write about in the Death and Supernatural book. So I'm grateful to be here with you, Gail. Thank you.
And your book was looking a little ghostly there itself. So I'm Gail Z Martin, and Morgan Bryce is Gail. I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, and more. As Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance, but all of the modern day worlds are ones where Sam and Dean could walk into and feel right at home. I am very thrilled to have been asked to write a chapter in Lynn's There'll Be Peace When You Are Done. They're on the Supernatural Fandom Track here at Continual and the Supernatural TFWNC group on Facebook. And I'm a regular columnist for the Winchester Family Business blog. So yes, I've gone down the rabbit hole and it has no bottom. I hope I never find one. So grief in Supernatural. Now, before we get into things in the actual show itself, let's talk about the moose under the table, which is the 1-year anniversary of the show coming to an end, at least for now. I may be in denial, but I'm sticking to it. That we're all counting down to it. All the diehard fans know it's coming. We just saw posts from the actors on commemorating the 1-year anniversary of the last day of shooting the last episode of the last season. So yeah, we're really hitting this hard. Why does it matter to us so much, and how do we deal with it? Lynn?
I mean, it matters to us because instinctively we as humans always know when the anniversaries of loss happen, whether it's a loss from death or a loss from something like losing your comfort show, your favorite television show. Even interestingly, even if we're not consciously aware that an anniversary of a big loss is approaching, our bodies and our brains know that that's happening and we start reacting to it anyway. That's just kind of the way we're wired. We always think about anniversaries of good things and anniversaries of really difficult things. So I think it's very normal that fans have started to think about the fact that it's going to be gone for a year. There's something sort of special about the first year after a loss because this is the first New Year's where I haven't had a new Supernatural. This is the first springtime when we're not looking for the finale coming. This is the first September or October when the show hasn't come back on. For 15 years, we sort of set our calendars, those of us who were really passionate fans, by what was going on with our favorite show. So it's been a year of little losses on top of that big loss and coming up to the biggest loss of all, which will be the anniversary of that finale. This fandom has very complicated feelings about the finale. But I think no matter what your feelings are about it, the anniversary is going to be difficult. If you loved it, it's going to be difficult remembering that you had that at that time. If you hated it, it's going to bring up all the memories of why you hated it or found it painful. So I don't think anybody is going to be spared from some angst around the anniversary coming up.
And of course, on top of that, because of the current unpleasantness, we also lost all of the conventions in between where we could have grieved with the cast and with each other in person. So there's also been that isolation aspect to the grief, which is not what we normally have experienced with grief. Susan, what about you? What do you think?
Well, that's not a small thing. I think that when we are collectively grieving, we do find some measure of help through that. But because of, as you mentioned, the unpleasantness, we can't be together. We can't share the same kinds of, we can't share the spaces that we might have before. Right now, we have online and we have ways of accomplishing that grieving, but it's not the same as if we were at a convention where we could have lots of group hugs, lots of that attention, or being able to hear in person what the cast members have to say about it. As Lynn was talking about, grief anniversaries are always painful moments. Whenever we cross that line where we have a moment of remembering the loss. I mark the first few days of the month because I lost my father and my mother and my sister within 6 months' time. And they were all on right around, my father was the 4th, my mother was the 2nd, my sister was the 5th. So every time a month begins, it's almost like I'm feeling that again. I'm crossing over that moment again. And so I think that when we have those kinds of touchstones, those dates pop up, I have something to talk about in a little while about the philosophy of that idea of kind of recalling grief that I'll mention at a time that's appropriate. But I think those anniversaries do hit us in ways that sometimes are very unexpected. And I know that it was really important for me last year to want to experience in real time all the other people watching at the same time, watching that finale at the same time, knowing that I was experiencing this in real time, at least with the people on the West Coast. But it didn't work out that way, and I had to wait a few hours. And I remember feeling pretty cheated by that, not being able to experience it. I didn't want to go and see what was happening with the people who were watching it on the East Coast because I didn't want to be spoiled. And then not able to watch it in real time on the West Coast I felt really cheated by that, which I think, again, is a valid thing. We're so, when we're collectively grieving something, we want to feel it together. If that makes sense.
Travis?
Yeah, I think that Lynn and Susan both hit really important points. With Lynn talking about like those anniversaries and how it plays a role in our bodies, and a lot of my veterans that I work with, they'll be struggling with sleep, dealing with aggression and irritability, and just not sure why. So it's through questioning, and luckily we do like a pretty decent intake when I get to know them, like, oh, when were your deployments? What did you guys do? So that I can always ask, like, well, what happened in October? Oh, well, that's when I went to Iraq. What happened? And we get to talk about that. And then they realize, so we start to normalize it, like, hey, be aware that every October you may feel those things come up. And by preparing for it, we can work through it. And like Susan was talking about with the conventions being gone. And, I know New York Comic Con just happened and I had family there and they had a great time. And it's great that people are starting to interact again. But yeah, losing that community also takes a hit. Yes, we have the internet, we can do stuff like this and people can comment and share and everything. And, I'm lucky enough to be able to talk to you gals every month. But I think that's something to pay attention to also, is now that things are starting to come back, it's going to help really process the grief, because when we avoid processing it, you get delayed grief and it goes on and it can get much more complex.
And as you often do, you led right into my next question on the delayed grief and being able to process, because before the last 2 years, I had heard often people saying, oh, I don't go to funerals. What good are funerals? Nobody needs to go to funerals. And now we've had 2 years without funerals. And there is a closure. You don't hold funerals for the dead, you hold them for the living, because the living need the closure in the community. And in Supernatural, we've seen a number of hunters, pyres. We also know that Mary got a headstone, but I can't imagine that she got a funeral. Jess got a funeral, but Sam didn't really get to go. He hallucinated it, but he didn't get there. So let's talk about how we need some of these ceremonies in the show and in real life to not have that delayed grief reaction and to get that sort of, maybe not ever complete closure, but a step toward healing or acceptance. Susan?
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about that, because again, the rituals, the things we go through are really important markers for us that help us through that grief process. I was going to talk a little bit about the importance of photographs and what they mean to get us through. When you look at a photograph of someone who is no longer around, it in that moment brings them back in a way, brings them back to life for us in many ways. One of the things that I think is really important, Roland Barthes, who is a French philosopher, talked about this, where when you're looking at a posthumous photograph, someone's who is no longer, but it tells us that person was real. It shows us the reality of that person. And so when I think about how the show represented that with Mary's photograph and what that meant to, Dean carries it around like a talisman. For Sam, he has no real memories at all that he can think of Mary other than her picture. And so he can't even, I think, get that reality of her the way that Dean can, because, for Dean, it's a memory. For Sam, he's looking at someone that he never really knew and only knows by virtue of that photograph. And I think the importance of that can't be understated. Later, when Mary is able to come back, I think a lot of those yearnings that Sam had, or that inability to grieve, Dean's grieving what he lost his whole life. Sam's grieving what never was for him. So when he sees that photograph, I think that it's a touchstone in so many ways for both. The boys have different reactions to it. But again, for that moment that they're looking at that photograph, Mary, it assures them that Mary was a living person, was alive, was a reality. And so I think being able to um, to look at someone. We've only had photography not quite 200 years now. And so prior to that, you had to be really rich or noble to have your portrait painted by an artist. Once photography, daguerreotypes, and then photography came in the mid 19th century, suddenly the common person could have a representation of their physical form, which hadn't happened before. And so when we look at what photography, and now, of course, everybody's got a cell phone and we've got tons of pictures all around us. How do we use that photograph to relive those moments, to bring that person back to life in a way that will help us grieve, and get through this process? So I think that's one of the most important things that the show does, is that those photographs of Mary and the one of Dean as a toddler or a little child. I think those play such important roles in the grief that the boys have to deal with as far as their family losses.
Well, and there's that quintessentially supernatural quote of Sam's where he's telling somebody that he lost his mother when he was a baby, but he got to meet her later in life and they got along okay.
Yes, yeah, he lets Claire know that yes, later.
And then, of course, the importance of those photos that you mentioned in the end of season 10, when Dean is standing there with Death's scythe, and the photos are really what changes everything. So, yeah, very important. Travis?
And Travis.
Yeah, no, while Susan was talking, it made me think about the first episode where Dean goes back in time, and he gets to see John and Mary and their grandparents, and what's that like for him, and getting new memories of his mom and getting to see her in a different way. And then knowing when Sam gets to go back with Dean the second time, and he can't even speak. He's like, you're so beautiful, and he doesn't understand that, like, you're talking to your mom and she doesn't know you're her kid. So like that's what I kept thinking about, and how weird that would be, is meeting your mom for the first time in your mid-20s, and only having a picture that your brother has to kind of, and the stories that he had until he was 4. So that would be real tough. So yeah, I think the way that Susan phrases, like, Sam is grieving, never having that. And you see that play a lot, and he brings that up to Dean on a few occasions, where he's like, I never got to have a relationship with her. And even when he's playing like Words with Friends, when Dean's playing Words with Friends with Mary in like season 11 or 12, when they're doing it, and she's not even talking to Sam because she feels guilty and not even knowing how to handle talking to him. So the grief goes both ways, because she feels so guilty for doing what happened. So you see it a lot between those three.
Well, and you mentioned the time travel episode. Sam also gets this moment of kind of a weird closure with young John, who just goes off on what kind of a person would drag his children around like that, and what a terrible father. And Sam's just, what do I say? But the validation going on there of the, what if I'd have known this person earlier? How different would it have been? And sometimes that's important in grief. Lynn?
Yeah, when Susan was talking about photographs, I remembered I saw a post the other day that analyzed the photos that old Sam had in his house when he died. And it was interesting because he had a number of photos of, a couple of them anyway, of the whole family, but it was from when Mary came back and when John visited them on the 300th episode. So one of them that they used was actually from the Entertainment Weekly photo shoot of the actors, but that was one that they had of all 4 of them together. And I thought, isn't that interesting that they thought about the fact that those would be really important to Sam for exactly the reasons that Susan was talking about. Those are his memories of his mother. And that was sort of like their stolen 24 hours of happy family time. So of course, Sam, when he was dying and getting ready to go to heaven, had those photos around him. I was also thinking that photos are a really important way of remembering people that we've lost. The Winchesters never had, we saw the same 3 or 4 photos. That was it. That's what they had from their childhood. But there were also that I think that's why certain other things were so incredibly important to them as connections, objects of connection to the people that they'd lost. I mean, it's why the Impala is so incredibly, incredibly important to Dean. It's why that leather jacket that some in real life terrible person stole from Jensen Ackles, so Dean couldn't keep wearing it. But that, he had those objects. The amulet, I think that's the amulet. It was important to Dean. I think it was also important to fandom because it was our connection to the brothers' early relationship. So there was tremendous grief in the fandom when the decision was made to throw that away, and tremendous joy when the decision was made to bring it back. So while they don't have a lot of photos, they do really hold those few objects that they do have very, very important. We saw Sam in the last episode in the finale. He had kept Dean's duffel and his jacket and his sweatshirt, and Miracle, the dog, of course, but he had kept things of his brothers, again, something to remember him by, because he didn't have a whole lot of photos. So I think those objects were there.
Well, and of course, he was wearing Dean's watch when he died. It probably
Right, the
didn't work
watch,
anymore,
yes.
but
Yeah.
he had the watch. And you're mentioning photographs. I can't help but think about the photograph they burned after the episode where Joe and Ellen died. There was just such a fatalism in burning the photo, because it was sort of like letting go of that memory brought an awful lot of complex emotions with it to burn that. So that was very, very resonant. Now,
before we go to the next question, just one thing that Lynn was mentioning about is, and then with the Samulet in fanfic and Dean's response, like, I don't need that to tell me how I feel about my brother, and then she gives it to him anyway. And he hangs it from the rearview mirror, which I thought was just very beautiful and a way to kind of symbolize and wrap that whole piece up.
Robbie Thompson can always be counted on to value this amulet as it should be valued in multiple episodes and in multiple forms.
Absolutely. Now, we had some other grief anniversaries. Sam just couldn't catch a break on his birthday. Because if I'm marking time correctly, he died in Cold Oak on his birthday, which meant Dean went to hell on his birthday. And just time after time, Sam's birthday was no good luck. We mark the loss of something. We also mark all those different kinds of personal anniversaries. What about the grief anniversary around something that's supposed to be happy, a birthday, other kinds of anniversaries? We have that in fandom. How do we deal with that? Or how do we deal with it even when that bleeds over real life? Susan?
Well, I think, it really kind of gives us that push-pull of, emotions where it's supposed to be something that we enjoy. And yet, if too many things happened, I really do see that Sam, has to be ambivalent about, oh, I'm not talking to you, phone. I got a new phone and it I don't know what the catchword is, but it's always interrupting me. Sorry. But I think about the episode with all the holidays when the wood nymph is there and, Mrs. Butters, and she creates and recreates all these holidays for the boys that they really never had growing up. Even the Thanksgiving, they had a bucket of extra crispy and, dad passed out on the couch, or they had, their Christmases were hit and miss at best. And so all of their holidays seem almost in a way superfluous to their lives because they don't genuinely or generally take time to celebrate any of them. From what we saw, even when Dean really wants a Christmas, Sam is resistant to that because it doesn't have the same meaning that it would have had they grown up with an actual Christmas that mattered. And so when Mrs. Butters gives them this awesome Christmas, and Dean decides, we're keeping her. But that, I think, there's still always going to be that 9, bad things happened on this day, no matter what it represents. So having to overwrite some of that is really difficult to do, I think. Travis was mentioning pain, when we come across those anniversaries, those things that happen. I remember my mother telling me she had a miscarriage about 4 or 5 years before I was born, and that baby was due in September. And she used to say for years and years, September would come along, and she lost the baby sometime, I think in the 4th or 5th month. So September would come around and she would always feel like she had something to do, that there was something, and she couldn't ever put her finger on it until she would remember, oh, that was when this was supposed to be happening and didn't. And so that's another form of grief, that, when we're expecting something to happen and it doesn't. I think that's, again, we mark those dates and they sit there, even if they're in our subconscious. I think they show up, like Travis said, they show up in our bodies. They show up in ways that we might not even expect.
Mm-hmm. Lynn?
Yeah, and there's also that idea of anticipatory grief, which I've just started to think about as I was listening to you, Susan. And anticipatory grief can be our way, our brain's way, our body's way of preparing ourselves for something that we're going to lose. So in that sense, it's a healthy and adaptive thing, but it can also, you can sort of get stuck in it and carried away in it, and it can preclude you from enjoying the time that you have left before this impending loss. And I really struggled with that at this time last year when Supernatural came back, and I was so happy to have it come back and so excited and so aware this is the last of it. Like, you have to savor every moment. But every moment for me was also tinged with, this is the last time that we will have a premiere. This is the last time that we will have the penultimate episode. The last time we'll have the series finale. Like, it really did. It was a struggle for me the entire time to really be present so that I could really enjoy all those moments without that anticipatory grief constantly sort of hanging over my head. And I think all those feelings are coming back now too, because I'm remembering what it was like. I find myself, I have a file of what happened every day from the time they went back to shooting in the fall of 2020 to the time they wrapped. So I have there's photos and tweets and all kinds of things. And I find myself going in there every day to get back into the headspace of, where was I? What was I thinking? What was I feeling a year ago? So I'm now very aware that I was really struggling with that anticipatory grief. And it's kind of come back around the anniversary too.
Okay, Travis?
One thing that Susan was mentioning when she kind of referenced my comment earlier was what we call them is live dates. We have these dates in our lives that really impact us. And then kind of going with what Lynn was talking about, I think I have a few veterans that they struggle with sleep, they struggle with irritability again, and they're like, I only have, say you have to go to work tomorrow, you have a really big meeting in the morning and you can't sleep. It's like, oh, if I go sleep right now, I get 3 more hours, I get 2 more hours. And it starts tricking us. Whereas we said like, oh, awesome, I get 3 more hours of sleep. The approach that we have helps it not, so we're waking up every hour. And that's anticipatory grief, right? Like, oh, I only have another 2 days before I have to return back to my unit or get deployed or this. Instead of saying like, I get 2 more days to hang out in San Diego, it's, I only have 2 more days to hang out in San Diego. And that little shift can really impact us. Going back to your question, Gail, with like the birthdays, with Sam and with Dean, and living perpetual trauma constantly, they never really have a lot of downtime to even just relax. So I wonder if that also plays a role. Whereas a normal person, my grandfather dies on my birthday. Like my birthday's sad, I think about that, right? That type of thing. Whereas Sam, like, I died, my brother went to hell, I stubbed my toe, I lost my shoe, whenever, bad day at Black Rock or whatever. But thinking about those things, it's constantly happening to him. So I wonder how much for him it's just like, this is just a Tuesday. And just
Well,
keep going.
Tuesday.
How many Tuesdays have you had?
Yeah.
Yeah. Tuesdays themselves, grief anniversary.
Mhm.
What about the complexity of moving on? Because in the show, Dean died, Sam moved on. Dean hadn't been real successful moving on when Sam went to hell, but Sam was more successful, arguably, than Dean had been, raised Dean Jr., lived a number of years. How do we reconcile moving on with feeling like maybe we've gotten less attached or left something behind? Even with the actors, we're thrilled that Jensen is doing Batman the Long Halloween and The Boys and so many other projects. We're thrilled that Jared is doing Walker, and we would love to see them do this. But I think part of us are also afraid that maybe they're going to forget Sam and Dean and us and the fandom and the story. How do we make space for what was and what has to happen going forward? Lynn?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So I teach a graduate course in grief and loss. And one of the things that has happened in theories of grief and loss over the decades is that we've kind of moved away from this idea that you have to give up your connection. You have to, goodbye, you were a part of my life, I am moving away from you. You never really move on from someone who you've loved and you've lost. Instead, now what we focus on when we're trying to help someone who's stuck in their grieving is to develop a way of maintaining that connection that also leaves room for new connection. That's really the challenge. And it's difficult to do because there is that fear of, if I even change the way I'm connected to that person, does that mean I'm forgetting them? Does that mean I'm disloyal? Does that mean I'm doing something wrong? So it's hard for somebody who's survived beyond someone they love to do that. I think it's really interesting to see what happens to Sam. And I'm kind of incredibly grateful that they included that part in the finale, even though it was honestly really hard to watch, because it's clear that Sam never gives up his connection to Dean. He absolutely still has it. He sometimes goes back and lets that connection kind of ground him, lets himself sit in the Impala and remember his brother and sort of hold physically the steering wheel where Dean's hands were. So he doesn't move on in the sense of, oh, well, that was my brother, he died a long time ago. But he does move on and keep on living in the sense that Dean really encouraged him to do. And he's able to do that partly for Dean, I think, and partly for himself, because he knows that, he promised to always keep fighting, and he does. And we don't see him just sitting and moping. We see him raising a child and having joy with that child and leaving hunting and having a different life. So I think Sam has shown very successfully doing that, coping with losing someone, never losing that connection, but also being able to keep going and build a life. That's a tremendously hopeful message. I never sort of understand when people interpret, I do understand, I guess I just interpret it differently, that some people did interpret the finale as Dean gave up and just, said, okay, I'm going to die. And that's the message of the finale, when to me, that message is clearly keep fighting. And Sam shows that, yes, you can do that. I think that's so needed and so hopeful and so in keeping with the whole point of the 15 years of the show.
Yeah. Well, in real life, we see tragic stories where a couple get hit in a car accident on their honeymoon. yes, they were just starting a new life, but doesn't mean they gave up. Bad things happened. And that's kind of my take on that, is that, yes, they were free of Chuck for whatever period of time, but sometimes bad things happen even when you're free. So yeah, that's a hard thing to come to terms with. Travis, what do you think?
It makes me think about survivor's guilt that I work with a lot of my clients. And a lot of them, exactly what you talked about when you're kind of introducing this question, is like, if I don't mourn, I'm forgetting. And so I have veterans that their whole life is around just being depressed and dwelling and never wanting to stop looking at that day, so that way their lives, like the people who they lost, don't go away. And then I asked them, I was like, if those friends were here today, what would they tell you? Oh, they tell me to pull my head on my ass, or they beat my ass. All right, well, what would they want you to do? They want me to live. So now we got to live twice as hard, right? Not be just like live in depression, but live twice as happy of a life. So we have to push ourselves harder. And I think that's what Sam did. And you notice this throughout the series, whenever Dean dies and Sam doesn't go looking, and then Dean gets mad at him for not coming. Like, why didn't you look for me? Oh, I did for 3 months. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to go live my life. But you see this thing where Sam's like, I'm not going to forget. I'm going to honor my brother, and I'm going to live my life because it's the life that I wanted to live. And finding that cohesion between the two of what you want and how your values line up is huge. And when we process survivor's guilt, we realize that, yes, we did lose somebody, and we can live a life that's meaningful, that would honor them. And I think that's what Sam did.
Okay, Susan?
Oh, I agree with that. I think a big part of the difference, of course, at the end, and this is something that Lynn touches on when she was blogging about that final episode, is that, this could have happened on any hunt. It was always a possibility that they were going to end up on the wrong side of something, whether it was wolves or vampires or demons or whatever it was, whatever hunt they went out on, there was always that potential for death. And so as Lynn mentioned, Dean going out in this way is it's blaze of glory. It is, because he's doing what he has always done. But I think a big difference here too is that, Sam's first instinct is to stop the death, stop the, I'm gonna get the first aid kit, I'm gonna find somebody, we're gonna, and when Dean finally gets him to stop a moment and recognize that, they've done this how many times, and Dean's actually okay with it. And I think him being okay with it and telling Sam it's okay, and getting Sam to tell him it's okay to let go, I think is a huge, huge thing. And that's what both of them needed, I think, in that moment. And that's what I think allows Sam to move on. It's not like he's forgetting Dean at all. And, he names his child Dean. So, there's enough of that to where you do see some tradition, young Dean, as his father lies dying, has the anti-demon possession tattoo on his arm. So we see that Sam has passed that along, at least, to, his son. But I think that, like Travis was talking about with survivor's guilt, Sam had a lot of that in other moments when Dean died. But I think that in this case, they wrapped it up so beautifully in that scene, in that moment where their foreheads touched, and they had that moment that was, that had all of us just sobbing for days. Yeah, so I haven't watched it again for a long time, and because I know that I'll probably start sobbing again. But I think that really helps at the end. I really think that both of them finally saying it's okay was also, it's okay to the fandom to let us go in a way, you know, it's okay. We're going to be okay. You're going to be okay. And I think that might have been the message in there as well.
And then that beautiful symmetry of when Sam is dying, Dean Jr. giving his father that same permission that he gave Dean to go. It's okay. I just thought, wow, it's going to make me, I'm going to stop talking about it. I'm going to get emotional. I'm thinking about it too much, but that was very beautiful.
Now, and this is just up in this last round of questions. It's one thing when it's hard enough to lose somebody when you're in a good place with them, when the death happens. But when it's complicated, when you're not in a good place with that other person, you're estranged, you haven't seen them, you're at odds. And throughout the years, the boys went back and forth on the different times they died, how close they had been right before the death, and how that impacted, I think, their reaction to the death. In season 15, the final time, they had a long stretch of being good with each other. How do those complications affect Grief Anniversary, ours and the characters? Susan?
Oh, well, I think that, yeah, I think wherever we are emotionally with someone, you know, I mean, losing them is going to impact us in different ways. But I think, yeah, they'd had that time. I felt so much better when Lynn was writing the blog about how it had been some time. It wasn't just, you know, oh, they just got back from the last thing and then boom, this very next hunt. It was a number of years at least, you know, or it was at least months and months where they had that ordinary life, as the song says, and they had that opportunity to taste that. So I think that changes also how we feel. It changed how I felt. I know a lot of people were like, what? How did it happen so soon? And all of that. But knowing they had that stretch of time, and maybe if they, you know, had a calendar up there or something to where we knew, you know, or even a little thing across the bottom, a scroll across the bottom, you know, 5 years later or whatever, it might have gotten rid of some of that anxiety that people felt, that it was too soon, too quick, too immediate. But I thought that made me feel so much better about Dean being willing to go, because he'd had that, and they'd had that time. I love the moments, you know, Sam doing laundry and Dean, you know, cooking, and the things that they did as normal people were a gift after so much time, and having Chuck hanging over their heads. So this was a real gift for them, and I think for us, because we get a chance to see what that normal life would be for them.
Yeah, the tip off for me, the time had elapsed, was when we saw Sam leaving the bunker that last time with Miracle, and Miracle struggled to go up the steps. Miracle had been a young dog at the beginning, and I thought, why are they showing this dog having trouble? And I thought, oh, we're supposed to realize Miracle's old now. And so there had to be a passage of time there. So that made me feel better too. Travis?
Yeah, just thinking about that, the relationship that we have with a person at the time of their passing, and the way that Sam and Dean, I mean, Dean says it many times, like, I'm going to die hunting. You know, it's very much foreshadowed throughout the series. And I think that's the best way for him to go. I love the fact that they had great times. You know, they had the pie day and they got to go enjoy things. And you see Dean like genuinely happy. And you get to see that because the world's not shitting on him all the time now. So I love that fact. And I think it did help with some closure. I know sometimes people don't always get that. I think a few fans, the way that they look at that finale, feel like they didn't get their closure. that they were cheated, and hopefully they're finding acceptance with it now that we come on that year mark. Because, you know, these are characters we've loved for the last 16 years. And how the story plays and how we view everything, it is hard. And it is a loss, and people do feel it. And we get to see these characters be immortalized by the memes, the GIFs, you know, the cast themselves saying like, hey, listen, this was half my life. You know, this is a huge portion of my life. I will never stop having a part of me being Dean or Sam. And whether they're in The Boys or they're on Walker, they're going to carry that with them. Like, that's always going to be a part of them. So I think that helps me, knowing that they care so much. They're like, hey, look, I'm sad these guys are gone too. And I think that helps too, is knowing that they're processing it just as much as all of us.
Okay, Lynn?
Yeah, I think as we're talking about this, one of the reasons I think the finale was so hard for so many people is because the year or so leading up to the end of the show was really contentious in the fandom. The fandom had become pretty fractured, and there were a group of people who wanted things to go one way and a group of people who wanted things to go another way. And the largest group of people who didn't care, just wanted it to go some way that was satisfying. But there were sort of three groups of people that weren't on the same page. And I had never really thought about it like that until right now as we're talking. But of course, it makes a loss so much more difficult when the relationship with the thing that is, or the person, in this case, the thing that's going to be lost, is complicated. And the relationship with Supernatural, for most fans, had become complicated in some way. So I'm realizing for the first time that that's probably a big reason why this was such a difficult loss. I was also thinking that for Sam and Dean, I would say the vast majority of their losses were not the kind of loss that happened in the finale. They were losses that were untimely and unexpected, and of someone that they had some kind of conflicted relationship with. You know, when John died, you know, they were just coming off of, they had, you know, lost him. He had the big falling out with Sam. Their relationship was really contentious. They didn't really have time to put it back together before he sacrificed his life for Dean. So it's no wonder Sam and Dean had so much trouble dealing with John's loss, because that was complicated. Castiel's death in the 18th episode of season 15. Season 15, Castiel and Dean spent mostly butting heads and trying to work out their relationship that had gotten very fractured, and barely got a chance to really do that and enjoy that before Castiel was taken to the empty. So again, that was a loss that was complicated. Rowena, hugely complicated relationship that they went from enemies to reluctant allies to, I think, especially with Sam and Rowena, a real sort of mutual appreciation and understanding, and then boom, they lost her. So I think most of their losses were very complicated by these kind of things.
Well, folks, as always, we have blown through our time. And as always, there's so much more we could talk about. But when we do our last round here to tell people where they can find you online, if there's some comment you want to make about this grief anniversary or dealing with the grief, words of wisdom, or at least suggestions, please offer those up. Susan.
Oh, this is really on the spot. I don't know that I have any words of wisdom. I mean, I've dealt with a lot of death. I've dealt with grief. I'm still dealing with grief all the time. But, you know, I think that a lot of it is recognizing it and not feeling bad about feeling bad, that we, you know, that we recognize that we can be okay with that. I think a lot of people go, oh, you know, if they have people in their lives who are saying, oh, it's just a TV show, you know, get over it. It's not. It's really not. And it's okay to grieve and actually grieve this. So I think giving yourself permission to grieve is probably one of the most important things you can do. That you're not going to just get over it, regardless of the loss.
And where do we find you on?
Actually, I'm on, I am on Twitter. Suze 105 is where I am on Twitter. I think you can find me there. We also, the Death in Supernatural, we have a deathinsupernatural@gmail.com for emails, and Mandy and I are talking. We're in the talking process of possibly getting another edition of, because now we have had so many more deaths, and we want to look at
Volume
those.
2.
We have so many more. Yeah, we need to have a death volume 2. So we're in talks about that. So the deathinsupernatural@gmail.com is still viable.
Awesome. Thank you. Lynn?
You can find me on all social media at FangasmSPN. I think Susan said the most important thing for people to remember, which is that it's okay to feel your feelings about the loss of something like a television show when it is really important. I guess the other thing I'd say is that sometimes when you feel very strong feelings about something, it's hard to allow someone else to have different feelings about that same thing. And I think it's really important that we not attack each other for our feelings or for what we love or for what we're passionate about or for how we choose to deal with either celebrating the show or loving the characters or mourning the characters. And if we could all sort of understand that we're all a little bit tender around this anniversary time, and that's normal, maybe fandom can be a little extra gentle with each other and avoid calling each other out for silly things like, I don't like that you like those two characters. They're not the ones I like.
Okay. Travis?
You can find me on Twitter at the Marine_Peer, PEER. Again, that compassion towards the community and the self-compassion of allowing yourself to feel, and always keep fighting.
Okay. And I'm pretty easy to find at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com. All the social media is a variation of those names, and the Supernatural TFWNC group. I think my tidbit would be that after the last 2 years, we are all very fragile and easily cracked. And so just to put in that little bit of allowance and compassion when we get unexpectedly strong reactions from other people about seemingly small things, it's not just the thing, it's the last 2 years and a collective everything. And so deep breath and a little bit of compassion. So thank you so much for being wonderful, wonderful panelists. And thank you all for watching and listening. There'll be more Supernatural coming up here on Continual. So we'll see you online.